Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to IGE Distinguished Lecture Forum as a virtual format. Today, I'm so very delighted to have an outstanding speaker, Dr. Nikolás Lardy, as our special guest, who is one of the most respected experts on Chinese economy as well as US-China relations. I'm so very confident that his exceptional insights will help us better understand one of the most critical global issues facing us these days. Now, before his speech, allow me to say a few words about his exceptional credentials. Mr. Lardy is currently Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, following his distinguished services at various places, including Brookings Institution as a senior fellow, as well as professor at the University of Washington and the Yale University School of Management. He is an author of numerous important books and articles on the political, economic, and financial issues related to China and their policy implications for Asia and beyond over the last 40 years, I should say. Mr. Lardy holds a PhD degree from University of Michigan and currently is also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I would like to thank Dr. Lardy very much for joining us live from Washington, D.C. This 8 p.m. over there, late hour. I appreciate that very much. Out of your very busy schedule, as I understand it, you just came back from Bordeaux, France, a nice place, and you're scheduled to move on to Wisconsin very shortly. So we thank you very much for being with us at this late hour today. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Lardy, who will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes or so for his opening speech, which will be followed by a conversation session between Dr. Lardy and myself in the form of a fireside chat for the rest of our time. Dr. Lardy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Zhuan, for that very kind introduction. I certainly welcome this opportunity to address the IGE audience. The topic is one very close to my interests about why is the Chinese recovery relatively weak and what should we see as the future outlook. I would like to come straight to my main conclusion, which is the recovery has been weak primarily because private sector investment has been very weak beginning in 2022. To appreciate this, we need to have some background. And the background is that China was very hostile to private business for at least the first decade and even for the first 2 decades of economic reform. When reform began in the late 1970s, private businesses were not even allowed, but they did allow so-called family businesses. And the main restriction on family businesses was that they could not employ more than 7 non-family members. This was a very, very restrictive environment. Not until 1988, 10 years after reform had begun, did China pass a law on private enterprises, which legally created the opportunity to have private businesses. And they got rid of the restriction of only having 7 non-family members. And there were still some problems. They only allowed proprietorships, that is single owners of firms, and there were no limits on liability, which was a big disadvantage for potential private companies. Not until 1994 did China create the company law, which allowed private limited liability companies for the first time. And not until 2006, when the company law was revised, did they allow single person limited liability private companies. So it was a very slow process of allowing the private companies to emerge, but it was fully transformative for China. The share of investment undertaken by state companies, which in the early 80s was more than 90%. There was 7 or 8% that was private, but that was mostly in agriculture, which had been privatized. But by 2012, the share of investment by private companies had declined to about 40 or 50%. And the private share had gone from 8% up to 50%. This was a very important transformation. It explains China's rapid economic growth. Most of the growth was generated by private companies. And interestingly, about 100% of the expansion of employment in urban areas, that is outside of farming, was the result of the expansion of private firms. Private firms also became extremely important in the development of China as a major exporting and trading country. Originally, almost all the trade was undertaken by by state companies. But today, the share of state companies in China's exports is less than 10%. So private companies expanded rapidly, drove the economy forward in terms of GDP, drove the economy forward in terms of employment, and drove the economy forward in terms of exports. Now, why am I relatively pessimistic right now? After several decades in which private investment substantially outpaced state investment, the situation has changed dramatically. In 2022, private investment was flat, no growth. State investment rose by 10%. This is a dramatic change from the pattern that I've just described. In the first 5 months of this year, private investment actually shrank slightly, whereas state investment rose by more than 8%. So we're now in a very, very different environment in which private companies are not playing the role that they had historically. Now, what accounts for this change? I would point to 3 things. There may be other factors, but I think 3 things should be kept in mind. First of all, we saw the crackdown on private internet companies, like Alibaba, Tencent, and so forth. A couple of years ago, the Ant Financial IPO was scrubbed. Big fines were imposed on Alibaba. Didi was not able to continue on its previous trajectory. So there was a crackdown on China's most successful private companies. The government and the party decided that they had too much power and they needed to be subject to more regulation. And it scrubbed off tens of millions of RMB in the market cap of these companies. Secondly, Xi Jinping has emphasized the role of the party in China, even within private companies. They have reintroduced this requirement that private companies have to have a party committee, which had started quite some time ago, but wasn't really pushed very much. Now it's being fully pushed so that private companies have to have a party committee. Even beyond that, there is this program that is referred to as golden shares. A golden share is when the state comes in and takes a small equity position in a private company, but that golden share allows the state and the party to appoint board members, to control the chairmanship of important board committees, and so forth. This has had a chilling effect on private economic activity. The third thing that has chilled entrepreneurial spirit of the private sector is the so-called common prosperity campaign that Xi Jinping has emphasized in recent years. This is nothing less than an attempt to get private companies to make substantial philanthropic charity contributions to help the state meet its goals on social programs. So big companies have been required or have volunteered, shall we say, to give the government tens of millions of RMB to use to support the common prosperity objective. So it's the crackdown on internet and platform companies. It's the emphasis on the role of the party in private companies. And it's the common prosperity campaign. All of these things have weighed very, very heavily on the private sector. So in the last year and a half, we have been in completely unknown territory in which the dominant role of private investment has been entirely undermined. Now, what are the implications of this for the economy? First of all, it has resulted in very weak growth of employment. If you take the whole period from 1978 on up to about 2015, or excuse me, 2020, virtually all new jobs were created in the private sector. State employment was basically flat. So if you move into an environment where private firms are no longer investing, the growth of employment is going to slow down dramatically. And that's exactly what we've seen, particularly among recent college graduates and other young people who no longer are able to get the kinds of jobs that they once expected. The second implication is that China's growth is now what I would call below its potential. I am a big believer in the idea and the concept of convergence, that low-income countries have the potential, underscore potential, to catch up with more advanced economies. That was certainly the pattern we saw in Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, where they were able to grow relatively rapidly until they reached about 55, 60% of the level of per capita GDP of advanced industrial economies. Then their growth slowed down. It was still very positive, but it was no longer 5, 6, 7%. It was more like 2, 3, 4%. China is at an early stage of convergence. Its per capita GDP measured in purchasing power parity is only about 20% of the level of advanced industrial economies. So it should be looking forward to another decade or so of fairly rapid economic growth, but they're not allowing the market to play the role that would accomplish this. Instead, Xi Jinping has prioritized politics over economic growth. So my relatively pessimistic view, well, it's a mixed view. On the positive side, I think China still has the potential to grow at 6, 7% for another decade if they liberalized and got back on the reform track. But if they stay on the Xi Jinping program of emphasizing political and emphasizing political control of private companies, I think growth is likely to be substantially below potential, which probably means something more like 3 or 4% over the next, let's say, 4 to 5 years. Now, we need to keep in mind, of course, that China's not only has China's growth slowed down, but growth in the rest of the world has also slowed down. So if China grows at 5% or even 4%, it's still growing much more rapidly than the average of advanced industrial economies. After all, Europe is now basically in recession. The United States is avoiding recession so far, but growth is not likely to be much more than 1% or so this year. So if China grows at 4 or 5%, which I think is still within reach for 2023, they're growing much more rapidly than the rest of the advanced industrial economies. But the press coverage is all pretty negative because they say China is growing much more slowly, and they don't really put it in the global context in which we can see that, yes, it is growing much more slowly, but it still looks pretty good relative to the rest of the world. Now, that's my view. I'd be happy to answer questions on this weak recovery, but before we turn to the questions, let me say a few words about the geopolitical situation, and particularly the relationship between China and the United States. We had a visit by the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, to Beijing just a few days ago. He had a series of meetings that culminated in a meeting with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So the good news is that dialogue is resuming. But I would say there has been very little change in what I would refer to as the fundamentals. I think the United States still seeks to restrict China's development. This is based on the speech of Jake Sullivan late last year, in which the US goal is to keep China frozen in terms of its level of technology, in terms of semiconductors, supercomputers, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and so forth. This was a fundamental change from the historic pattern and the historic policy of the United States, which was to say we would keep a generation or two ahead, but we would not have such restrictive export rules that China couldn't move ahead. Now we're saying we want to freeze China where they are, and the United States companies will continue to evolve and improve, hopefully, and so that the gap between the US and China would widen. This is a very, very fundamental change, and I don't think that has changed. There's no evidence that it has changed. The rhetoric has gotten a little bit better. Even Jake Sullivan is talking about de-risking rather than decoupling, but the basic policy remains in place. Even as Secretary Blinken was meeting with President Xi, the United States added dozens of Chinese companies involved in supercomputing to something that is called the Entity List. The Entity List is a list of companies to which US companies cannot export without getting a license from the Department of Commerce. Being on this list comes with what is referred to as, quote, a presumption of denial, end quote, of license requests. In other words, it's going to be very difficult for American companies to export to these companies. So dozens of companies, new companies, were added to the list, even as Secretary Blinken was negotiating and discussing bilateral relations with officials in the foreign ministry and with President Xi himself. When the Biden administration came into office, there were already about 400 companies on the entity list, but now there are more than 700 companies, Chinese companies, on the entity list, which makes it very difficult and perhaps impossible for US companies to sell to these companies. So Jake Sullivan talks about a small yard and a high fence. as his explanation of what we're doing, that we're only trying to restrict technology transfer in a very limited domain. But the reality is the domain is getting wider and wider over time. And this is feeding into the Chinese narrative and the Chinese belief that the goal of the United States is to restrict the expansion of the Chinese economy. So my view is, even though some administration officials are talking about de-risking instead of decoupling, if you look at the operational details, there's no change on the ground. We are increasingly restricting the flow of advanced technology in these areas to China. And of course, I don't need to tell this audience that the United States is exerting enormous pressure on countries like Japan and Korea and the EU countries to join in this effort to restrict the flow of technology to China. It's not only export restrictions that we've seen that are continually expanding, but the United States has been saying for months that there will be an executive order that will require a review of all outbound investment to China to make sure that these investments are not enhancing China's capability in the areas like semiconductors, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, supercomputing, and so forth. So I think we're in a very difficult situation. The dialogue has resumed, which is a very important development. But at least as I see it from an economic perspective, there hasn't really been any change. The US continues to promote highly restrictive policies that will inevitably have a negative effect on China's economic expansion and its technological growth as well. So I think domestically, for China, the problem is that the private sector is no longer playing the role that it had for more than 3 decades. Internationally, the problem is that the United States has undertaken a very, very restrictive policy on exports of technology, which ultimately will have an adverse effect on China's economic growth. So I'd be happy to continue the discussion and answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much for your brilliant and illuminating opening speech. That covers very important topics of interest to our audience here in Korea, especially the last point you mentioned about decoupling versus de-risking. There appeared to be some confusion between the concept of those two, but you clarified beautifully what that means and what that doesn't mean with this de-risking, because a fundamental restrictive stance US takes, especially in the area of strategically important areas like AI, semiconductor, and so forth. That stance is not in any way materially changed by the recent some positive progress with respect to opening up for talks, but practically and basically there hasn't been really much change on this. I think that's a hugely important clarification on this issue. I appreciate that very much. Now, since you have essentially given us the summary of the key messages, A, with respect to the economy, B, the geoeconomic implications of the US-China relations. You covered it already. So even though I had a number of questions listed down here, these questions may be in a way to follow up or sort of as a footnote type of questions related to the main issues that we have. Okay, so let me now start with the last point a little bit more. That is, you mentioned clearly that this risking really doesn't practically mean much with respect to continued restrictive stance on exporting and transferring high-tech sort of areas to China. And what would that mean for the strategic or policy implications for a country like Korea in dealing with this this new international order, if you like, the changing paradigm where now Korea is actively participating in US-led Indo-Pacific framework. Now, does that mean that then, because the de-risking doesn't really materially make any difference, this reshaping of global supply chain efforts led by United States, based on what you have said to us just before, it's not going to change in any important way anytime soon. That means we would have to firmly put that sort of a parameter in our business strategy, industrial strategy. Is that the way? Am I interpreting your point right?
Yes, I think, Dr. Jordan, I think that's exactly correct. I would amplify a little bit. I think in the United States government, there is a debate between National Security Council, which prioritizes national security, and some of the other government departments like the Department of Commerce or the Treasury Department. And we've seen Secretary Raimondo and Secretary Yellen taking a softer tone on China, saying that we need to de-risk rather than decouple. So they're trying to change, nudge the policy in a more balanced direction. But as I said in my remarks, I don't think they've had any effect in the policy on the ground, because as Secretary Blinken was in China, they added several dozen more companies to the entity list. So I think the United States is in an unusual position where the formulation of its international economic policy, which historically has been centered in the Treasury Department and the Department of Commerce, now has been outsourced. It has been outsourced to the National Security Council, where the team led by Jake Sullivan prioritizes security above anything else. And they have a very, very expansive definition of national security, which, as we've seen in many cases, has a policies, industrial subsidies, and so forth that are in violation of our long-term commitments at the WTO and are potentially very adverse in terms of their implications for countries like Korea and other allies and partners. As we've seen in the case of, the legislation on semiconductors and so forth, we are now trying to impose restrictions on Korean semiconductor companies that they cannot expand their businesses in China even if they're not at the frontier of semiconductor technology. So it's a strong reach to, well, I'm not quite sure what word I should use, to not just to influence, but to restrict what other foreign companies can do. And so I think, you know, even though Jake Sullivan in a more recent speech talked about de-risking, and he said, no, we're not trying to contain China. This is not decoupling. But I think if you're sitting in Beijing and you see the kinds of restrictions that are being imposed by the US government, it's very hard to see what's the difference between de-risking and decoupling. And I think that accounts for some of the reservations that the Chinese expressed in terms of their negotiations and discussions with Mr. Blinken, which quite frankly didn't really accomplish very much. We'll see what happens when some other cabinet members go to Beijing and have discussions with China. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to change the direction of US policy at this point, because as I said, it seems like our international economic policy is being determined overwhelmingly within the White House at the National Security Council, and they are downplaying economics. Everything is subordinate to their views about national security.
Yeah.
Even,
Right.
you know, even extending to such things as electric vehicles and other things which are not obviously immediately related to national security.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. Now, we may be once in a while interrupted by, not exactly interrupted, we are getting questions from our viewers through our chat room. Now, one of the questions that I would like to convey to you for your response is that you mentioned government, Chinese authorities, the Communist Party, pressing hard on high-tech companies like Alibaba and Tencent or others, major ones. Now, they are related to that. The question has to do with that. Isn't it true that there's a huge IT platform industry needs some form of regulation? You know, perhaps maybe a matter of degree, but given that their sort of power, the overall economic ecosystem has grown too big. So would you have any sort of comment or sort of perspective on this question? So the point I guess he was trying to make is that you know, it's not entirely, may not be entirely bad for the authorities to have some form of control or regulation. And is there any better way to regulate this very important industry within our economic system?
Well, let me just say, I agree very much with the premise of the question, which is a handful of internet companies, what some people call platform companies, had achieved perhaps excessive market power, and that they were not subject to much regulation. It was kind of the Wild West in which they could just keep developing and exploit their market positions. So I agree, some form of regulation was inevitable. It should have come a little bit sooner. It should have been a little bit more nuanced. When it finally came, it was late and was heavy-handed, and I think has had a chilling effect on private businesses more generally. So yes, some of those companies probably did have excessive market power. The government should have introduced regulations earlier that would limit those powers. Letting it go so long and then coming in with a very heavy hand, I think has had a negative impact on the private sector overall.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So if we sort of put it in simple terms, it was not entirely political that the party felt that these companies represented a threat. There was an economic rationale as well. The fallout has been to suppress the entrepreneurial spirits of the private sector, which, remember, has accounted for almost all of the job creation in China over the last 4 decades, and has accounted for a very large share of the growth of the economy, a very large share of the fiscal revenue. It's the dominant, it became the dominant part of the economy. So the government should be taking a little bit more nuanced approach.
Okay.
Their efforts to date, quite frankly, have not been very successful. I mean, periodically, even Xi Jinping has met with private entrepreneurs and told them how important they are to the success of China's economic development. But this has not been backed up with policies. It's been lip service that has not been very persuasive for private companies, as we can see from the investment data, where the private investment has basically slowed dramatically over the last 1.5 years.
Okay, thank you for your response, Dr. Lardy. And I also, I'm getting lots of questions from our audience. That means your presence, your speech are enormously popular today. Oh, now I'm getting off. Okay, let me, I'll change it. Okay, let me do this one. Okay. Now, this question is from your alma mater. This gentleman is a very famous, respected economist in Korea, Dr. Chung Gu-hyun, formerly president of Samsung Economic Research Institute and also professor at Yonsei University, Mr. Chung. Let me read this question for you. This is quite appropriate, I think. It's, okay, now let me see. He's starting with this sort of comment. De-risking is the realization on the part of US and EU. Actually, that term, de-risking, if I remember correctly, used first by Mrs. von der Leyen, EU president, de-risking and diversifying beyond China. But anyway, that you cannot survive without made in China products. De-risking is inevitable. We cannot have a long-scale decoupling. That's common. But I would appreciate if Mr. Lardy answers the following question. What is the impact of large city lockdown during the pandemic, especially Shanghai, on psychology of Chinese middle class? Do you think the pandemic trauma has alienated many Chinese citizens and made them to have less trust of the Chinese economy and government? Okay, further, let me finish this conversation. Some American businessmen, including Jamie Dimon and Elon Musk, have expressed in their visits to Beijing that decoupling is neither desirable nor possible. Mr. Lardy, do you think that the American business community necessarily listened to the American government? That's an interesting question for you.
Well, let me begin with a part of the question about the middle class. I do think we have to recognize that the recovery that has been underway now for a couple of quarters is highly dependent on the growth of private consumption. This is very different from the recovery after the Asian financial crisis and some of the earlier setbacks in China. The government, the recovery will depend substantially on increased private consumption. We saw very strong growth of private consumption immediately after the lockdowns were ended in the late winter and into the early months of 2023. But since then, private consumption has moderated. It's still reasonably strong, but it's not strong enough to drive the whole economy forward at a very rapid rate. And I think part of it goes to this question of the psychology, that the psychology of the middle class was damaged by the lockdown. There are fears about unemployment. They see a lot of unemployed youth. Private income growth has slowed down. And there's a property correction underway in many cities, which has led to a decline in prices. And that has a very substantial negative wealth effect because most urban households have a very large share of their wealth tied up in property. So all of those factors are tending to inhibit the growth of private consumption. So it has not been strong enough to drive the economy forward at the pace that we saw in the first quarter was very strong, but since the first quarter, private consumption growth has weakened. And how will that change? I think it remains to be seen. I think we'll need further another quarter or so to see if income growth picks up. But I do think there's a psychology of caution, and consumer sentiment has not fully supported the continuation of the recovery.
Okay, all right, thanks. Now, okay, before I come back to my own list of questions, let me try one more. This question, short questions from Ambassador An Ho-young, who was Korea's ambassador to the United States. He was asking, let me read this for you. President Xi Jinping can understand that his politics first is having economic consequences. He thinks he's making impact. Any prospect for him to change his policy?
Well, I think that's a question we'd all like to be able to give a confident answer to. I tend to think that he is he is placing less emphasis on economic growth per se as some of his predecessors. He's more talking about the quality of economic growth, which of course is very difficult to measure. But I think I would have to come down on the view that President Xi has emphasized political control as the most important element of his leadership. And that has extended, as I mentioned earlier, to more controls on private companies, more intervention in the market. And he seems to be willing to pay the price of slower growth in order to maintain more control. So if I put it in simple terms, it's control on the one hand, which tends to reduce the role of the market and private firms. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have liberalization, less control, less role for the party, more scope for private entrepreneurs. And he has consistently come down on the path of control, the role of the party, and limiting the role of the market.
Okay.
I don't think that's likely to change.
But how about, you did mention a very high unemployment rate, especially for youth. The latest data that I have seen show that more than 1 out of 5 young people young people defined as age 16 to 24 out of job. Now, and also this property sector driven economic financial vulnerabilities in the system are quite substantial. Whether it's not clear whether the government can control all this, especially in the regional government's side problems. Now, if this sort of economic vulnerabilities or fragility become more evident, then perhaps the ultimate leader may have to look at the reality they face in the economy, and perhaps that may be a way to we don't know, but possibly change the course toward more sustained growth.
Well, that's certainly a possibility, but I think we also have to take into account that China does face some very fundamental constraints. Debt to GDP is relatively high, approaching 300%. About a third of that is government debt. And so their ability to launch a kind of macroeconomic stimulus program like they did after the Asian financial crisis or during the Asian financial crisis is much more limited. So they do face that constraint that is, I think, fairly binding. I think since 2017, Xi Jinping became convinced, partly on the advice of people like Liu He and others, that to continue on the path of very expansionary policies, increased financial risk with very substantial negative political consequences down the road. So they've tried to moderate the growth of credit, and they've had some success. It's still very high, inching up a little bit, but it's not going up at the pace that it was before 2017. So you also have to ask yourself, if Xi Jinping became worried about youth unemployment and the slow growth, what could he do? Does he want to undertake or assume more financial risks in order to try to stimulate growth? It's a very difficult trade-off. What have we seen so far? Well, we've seen some very modest cuts of central bank in some of its benchmark interest rates. They're still fairly small. Maybe they will stimulate some increased investment or encourage households to spend some of their money, since the returns on bank accounts on deposit rate are sliding down. But so far, the response we've seen in economic policy, I would have to characterize as modest, reflecting some of these fundamental constraints coming from the financial side.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Just feedback to one of the questions raised by our audience. I would like to, before we move on, I would like to say something about that. The question was the difference between business perspective and government sort of guidelines. Jamie Dimon, Elon Musk visited China and say something different, appear to be different from what the government really want in the form of decoupling. But I think the way I interpret this is that business people are bound to have some ambiguity for obvious business reasons. So I'm talking to Dr. Jung Gu-hyun, and that very Jamie Dimon, right after Beijing visit, he stopped in Taipei, Taiwan, and said something different. So, this is all part of business risk management approach, but that doesn't really mean that de-risking is fundamentally different decoupling. I'm very much with Nicholas on this, because even those companies like Apple, now more recently Google, are trying to take away the main facilities, assembly plants from China to India. They're talking about, and Vietnam, and also doing this thing. From a business management perspective, that may be viewed as de-risking and diversifying away from much more condensed, concentrated China. But at the end of the day, that's exactly what decoupling was supposed to drive. Whether there's reshoring or friendshoring, let's have more reliable supply chain paradigm in the post-pandemic era. So that's what was entailed in sort of decoupling strategy. But to me, that's pretty much consistent with all those. What is your thought, Nicholas?
Well, Dr. Chun, I agree with you that the geopolitical conflict between China and the United States has created a great deal of uncertainty in the minds of American businesses, and they're reevaluating what their options are. I would tend to the view that so far, most of them are maintaining their presence in China. Some of them are, building a bit outside. You mentioned Apple. Apple is starting to produce handsets in India, but I believe at the present time, production in India accounts for only about 7% of Apple's total production. And it seems to be directed primarily to serve the Indian market. India has a very, very high tariff on imported handsets, about 25%. So if you want to be competitive, and that's a growing market, India has a large and growing middle class, big demand for handsets. And so Apple wants to be part of that market, but they're not using India as a production base to export to the rest of the world, at least not yet. China is still a better place because of the development of the supply chains of all the components and parts that are required to produce the handsets. They have better infrastructure and a better labor market for labor-intensive manufacturing. Remember, India has a very small manufacturing sector. And so at the margin, Tim Cook has decided to put a bit more in India, but it's mostly to meet the demand in the Indian market. Maybe that will change over time, and the importance of China will recede, but I don't think it's happened yet. That's just one example. And a lot of American firms in China are producing entirely for the domestic market, which is large and growing. Remember, China may not be growing at 6 or 7 or 8% like it used to, but it's going to continue to grow at 4% plus or minus, which is substantially higher than most other parts of the world. So China is going to continue to be an attractive market for some American firms and some European firms, and I must say some Korean firms, like Samsung would be an obvious example. So I don't think we're going to see a big pullout of companies out of China. I don't think decoupling is going to happen, even though some of the people in the National Security Council in Washington might like that to happen.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, diversify, right? But it's total exodus or exiting is not what was entailed. And also, any sort of changes in the private enterprises portfolio strategy move, have better balance amongst countries in the portfolio, of course, we are very much looking forward to soft landing of those changes rather than hard landing for the benefit of everybody, involved in this. Now, I would like to move on to, we have talked about real sector issues and geo-economic issues. Now, I would like to touch upon financial issues now here, because lately lots of attention have been paid to lackluster performance of Chinese stock market, and also foreign exchange market have shown very noticeable weakness of yuan. Now it's over 7 yuan to a dollar, which wasn't what many investors thought about some time ago. So now the first question that I have, actually, I received a question from our viewers just before. Now, how do you see this current level of yuan? Quite low compared to its historic or even recent standards. Is that something that government, do you think, decides to allow or tolerate as a way of perhaps stimulating export performance or something else? So, well, strictly from a market perspective, since unlike most of countries around the world, the Japanese authorities have lowered base interest rate lately, meaning that if other things are the same, yuan will become weaker. So that's understandable. But in the broader context, is weakening Chinese yuan is something that government appears to be tolerating or encouraging at this time? What is your thought on this foreign exchange market?
Okay, well, I think China's central bank, the People's Bank of China, has moved fairly consistently over recent years to allow the market to play a greater role in the determination of the value of the yuan or the renminbi. There's less intervention, and there's less, less talk about the value. And I think it's not surprising that the RMB has weakened. China's growth has slowed down. The sentiment is negative. As you mentioned, they're beginning to cut interest rates, whereas interest rates in the developed world, and certainly in the United States and Europe and so forth, have been rising, which means that a lot of portfolio investors are shifting out of renminbi denominated assets into other assets denominated in dollars or euros or pounds. And that leads to the weakness of the RMB. I don't see much evidence that the central bank is intervening to offset that. So I think the weakening, which we've seen recently, is primarily market driven, but I would agree with the way you phrased it. They are willing to see that happen. They would have the option, if they wanted to revert to the old policies, of intervening in the market more and trying to slow it down. I think they're letting it depreciate in response to underlying market forces. And this will continue. There will be portfolio outflows. Foreign investment in Chinese denominated bonds is declining and has been for several months or several quarters now, because, if you go back a year or two, Chinese interest rates were actually much higher on central government bonds than you could get in the West. And now those rates are coming down, and the rates in advanced economies are going up. So investors are shifting out of central Chinese government bonds and moving into assets denominated in dollars, euros, and other currencies. So it leads to an obvious source of weakness. The renminbi. And I think that could continue for some additional period of time. I don't think we're done with the rate cutting in China. China could cut interest rates again in the third quarter this year.
Okay, thank you, Nick. As time is, our time is approaching. But perhaps this may be the last question related to financial sector issues. Now, as you mentioned just before, we have noticed the change in the direction of capital flows lately, especially from China to countries like Japan. As for the equity investment side, and also some are coming in to Korea. Now, overall, what sort of what are the major risks and opportunities for foreign investors in the Chinese market? Because you know the Chinese economy and finance, the system and regulation altogether. So what in this slowing down environment, but it's not collapsing. It's still, as you said, we shouldn't forget that average growth rate that we expect in China is above global average and well above advanced country average. But other restrictions are still there. Communist Party enforced on the private sector. So I see pros and cons mixed there. But overall, for international investors interested in China market, what sort of risk and opportunities that should be considered most important?
Well, my general observation is that the equity market in China historically has been driven primarily by liquidity. When credit growth is expanding, the market tends to go up. And when credit growth moderates, the market gets weaker. So it's not necessarily driven by fundamentals, at least on average. There are not enough institutional investors. The market is still retail dominated and tends to be very short term in its orientation. So that's the background, which makes it a difficult market. Having said that, the majority of the shares listed in China today are private companies, which tend to be more efficient. They're not investing very much these days, but they tend to be more profitable than private companies. And they tend to be in the service sector, which is the major source of growth and likely to continue to be a major source of growth. The share of services in the economy has been expanding for about 5 or 6 years. It's now more than 50%. And I think that trend will continue. And many of the listed private companies are in the service sector. They're not the they're not the steel companies or the petro companies. They're more in services where I think demand will propel their growth forward over the medium term.
Okay, thank you. It's already over 9 p.m. In Washington, D.C. But please allow me to ask you one more question I'm receiving. It's somewhat different sort of kind of questions, but I promise this will be the last. Because like I said, because you're so very popular here, there are so many people waiting for your response on many questions. The last question that I would like to put forward to you has to do with the environmental issues. That is that, let me put it this way, how would you assess China's efforts to address environmental and sustainability concerns while maintaining economic growth? Now, Related to this, concerns have been raised. As you know, there's huge carbon emissions. China is the largest emitter of carbon in the world. And also, recently, Korea, has taken a greater interest in Chinese plan to build huge number of additional nuclear plants around their east coast side. That's our close to west coast side of Korean Peninsula. Now, how would you assess their efforts on this environmental front? Because after all, this is not just one country problem. It's a global issues, and it's essential that we have to have good cooperation from countries like China on this issue, especially from the vantage point of neighboring states like Korea. Thank you.
I think China's a very mixed picture in terms of its efforts to reduce, emissions. On the one hand, they are adding more capacity in wind and solar than any other country in the world. They're also moving much more rapidly than the United States in particular towards reliance on electric vehicles and phasing out internal combustion engines for automobiles, buses, and to some extent even trucks. So that's the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side of the ledger, they are continuing to build thermal power plants, and some of them are supposedly at a higher level of technology that leads to less emissions. I'm a little bit unclear on that. So they're moving ahead with some green technology, but they're also need to continue to build up their thermal power generation capacity, and this is a function of the fact that, they're still growing much more rapidly than the rest of the world, even though they're rapidly expanding their green technology. It's not enough yet to meet the demand for energy. There have been energy shortages, electric power shortages in some provinces in recent years, and that leads leaders in those areas to want to build up more reliable coal-fired power generation, since China has huge domestic supplies of coal. So it's a mixed picture. I think China's making progress. It would be better if it was a little more rapid. I think nuclear does play into this. They have been developing their nuclear industry, power generation industry, for quite a number of years now, and it is a significant contributor to the overall source of electric power generation. But coal is still more than 50%, and I think it will take a long time to bring that down significantly.
Okay. All right. Time is up. Once again, I would like to thank you, Dr. Lardy, very much for your insightful views, illuminating discussion, very much this very late hour over there. So on behalf of our members and audience, I would like to thank you once again, and have a great summer, and hope we can have you again next time, perhaps in person. Thank you very much.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chun, and thank IGE for organizing this event. I'm very happy I was able to participate.
Okay, great. Bye now.
Okay, bye-bye.